The scene in the auditorium astonished Anna. The historic chapel was full in almost every part. The congregation, intrigued, excited, eager, had sung the first hymn with unprecedented vigour and sincerity. Above the rest could be heard the trained voices of a large choir. The choir, normally perfunctory, seemed possessed of the same fervour. In the vast mahogany pulpit, the superintendent minister, the Reverend Reginald Banks, a stout, pale-faced man with pendant cheeks and cold grey eyes, stood gazing impassively over the assemblage. Next to him stood the revivalist, a mannequin compared to his colleague, and on the broad balustrade of the pulpit lay the cornet. The fiery, inquisitive eyes of the revivalist probed into every corner of the chapel, seeming to miss no detail of any individual face or the florid decoration. Even Anna, creeping quietly into a small pew in the balcony against the east wall, felt individually observed. Mr. Banks gave out the last verse of the hymn, and simultaneously with the introductory chord of the organ, the revivalist seized his cornet and joined in the melody. Massive, exultant sounds rose over the mighty volume of vocal sound, an incitement to victorious endeavour. The effect on the congregation was instant. A shudder of ecstasy passed through them like the wind through a field of corn, and it wasn't until the revivalist put down his cornet that the people resumed their seats. Amid the frou-frou of dresses and the subdued clearing of throats, Mr. Banks retired quietly to the back of the pulpit. The revivalist, mounting a stool, suddenly dominated the congregation. His glance swept masterfully around the chapel and the balcony. He raised one arm in a stilling gesture like a mesmerist, and the people, kneeling or inclined against the front of the pew, hid their faces from those eyes. It was as if the man had in a moment calculated their iniquities and had resolved courageously to stand on their behalf before God, but was not very sanguine as to the outcome of the enterprise. Everyone, apart from the organist, who was busy with his tune book looking for the next tune, seemed humbled, ashamed, as if caught in the very act of sin. There was a terrible and solemn pause, and then he began. "Behold us, O dread God, supplicants for thy mercy." He had a rich, powerful voice, sharp and incisive. The fiery eyes were tight shut, and Anna, who had a profile view of his face, could see that every muscle was tense. He had an extraordinary histrionic gift, and he used it with imagination. He had two audiences, God and the congregation. God was no more distant from him than the congregation, no less real, no less a heart to be influenced. Declamatory and full of effects carefully calculated, a work of art in fact, his appeal lacked nothing in discretion in its approach to the eternal. There was no minimizing of committed sin, and yet no insincere and grovelling self-accusation. A tyrant could have taken no offence at its tone, which seemed to pacify God, yet rendering its earthly listeners still more contrite. The culmination of the catalogue of wickedness and the swift, confident turn to Christ's cross was marvellously well done, and the congregation broke out into groans and moans and blessings and amens, and the pillars of distant rural conventicles who had come in from the confines of the circuit to the centre to partake of this spiritual excitation began to think that their time would not be wasted. "O God, send the Holy Ghost to us now," he pleaded with restrained passion. And then, opening his eyes, he looked at the clock on the front of the balcony, and he repeated, now, at 21 minutes past 7. Then, without shifting, his gaze seemed to pass through the clock and rest on some distant unknown dominion, and he whispered dramatically, "I see the Holy Dove." Mr. Banks gave out another hymn, and when it had finished, the revivalist, who had been resting in a chair, came forward again. "Friends and fellow sinners," he began, "some of you have come here tonight to hear me play my cornet. Well, you have heard it. I have played the cornet, and I will play it again. I would play it on my head if I thought it would bring sinners to Christ. I have been called a mountebank. I am one. I revel in it. I am God's mountebank, going about God's precious work in my own way. But God's precious work cannot be done even by a mountebank without money. And so there will be a collection for the work of the revival. During the collection, you shall hear my cornet again. If you are happy to give us your sixpences, then give. If you resent a collection," and here he adopted a tone of the most ferocious sarcasm, "keep your miserable sixpences and try to get 6 penn'orth of entertainment from them elsewhere." After another hymn and 2 more exhortations from the revivalist and the minister, the revivalist prayed. Voice ceasing, he remained in the position of supplication, and sobs broke out in various quarters. The revivalist began to softly sing, "Jesus, lover of my soul," and most of the congregation, standing, joined in. But the sinners, afflicted in the spirit, remained abjectly bent. "Blood of Christ atones," said the revivalist when the hymn ended. "The Spirit of Christ is among us. Let us turn to private prayer and drive the devil out of this chapel." After another hymn, the minister reminded the congregation that on leaving the chapel they would be able to purchase a signed photograph of the revivalist for £1 at the door. Then he announced that there would be a prayer meeting at 7 o'clock the next morning for the workers in the revival. The next morning, when Anna arrived, the door was ajar. She went in and found at the far end of the hall a meagre gathering of worshippers, with Mr. Banks on the platform. He gave out a verse and pitched it too high, but with a heroic effort the singers achieved the verse without breaking down. Anna noticed that, apart from herself, all the others there were old believers, tried and tested warriors of the Lord. And there was only one other woman, Sister Sarah Vawdrey. Sister Sarah Vawdrey, whose sole diversion was the variety of her religious experience. Mr. Banks prayed and assured the deity that although 21 souls had been ingathered the previous evening, the Methodists of Burslem were not satisfied. They wanted the whole of Burslem and would be content with nothing less. After fervent amens, more of the men prayed, and then, still kneeling, Mr. Banks, with oily politeness, said, "Would one of the sisters pray? Sister Tellwright?" Anna would have taken death and damnation for that moment to pass. She wrung her hands in despair, and then there came a preliminary cough from Sister Sarah Vawdrey. Sister Sarah Vawdrey was always happy to pray in public, and her invocations always began with the same phrase. "O God, we thank thee that this day we find our bodies out of the grave and our souls out of hell.